The CNN studio lights blazed as tension filled the air. John Boehner, the former Speaker of the House and Republican veteran, sat across from Jonathan Roumie, the talented actor known for his role in The Chosen and his growing political influence. Boehner's signature smirk appeared as he thought he had the perfect trap set. After all, this was the man who had led the House for years, orchestrating deals and navigating complex political battles. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would leave Boehner speechless and create the most viral political moment of the week. Former Speaker Boehner just tried something that backfired spectacularly. The clip would later read on Twitter. What Jonathan Roumie said next ended the entire segment and left him with absolutely no comeback. This wasn't just another political debate. This was the moment when a rising star in political discourse showed exactly why underestimating him is a mistake that even seasoned veterans like Boehner shouldn't make. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And make sure to hit that subscribe button because moments like this don't happen every day, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The stage was set for what Boehner thought would be an easy win. He was wrong, dead wrong. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who was sitting across from each other that night on CNN's primetime show. At 70, John Boehner had built his entire post-congressional career on one thing: being the guy who strikes deals and knows how to push his party's agenda. As Speaker of the House from 2011 to 2015, he had been at the forefront of every major legislative battle, from the budget crises to the government shutdowns. After stepping down, Boehner became a sought-after political commentator, regularly appearing on cable news, where his established brand was that of a seasoned insider who could get things done. But here's what made Boehner dangerous in debates. He had decades of experience. He came prepared with facts, figures, and tactical questions designed to disarm opponents. He was a seasoned politician, and many thought he couldn't be beaten in a debate. Across from him sat Jonathan Roumie, a 43-year-old actor from California, known for his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen. Before stepping into the political arena, Roumie had never held office, but he had spent years speaking on issues like faith, politics, and personal responsibility. His ability to connect with millions on social media had made him a rising star in the political conversation, especially among conservative audiences. Roumie had the unique blend of charisma and intellectual depth to hold his ground, and his experience in front of cameras gave him a confidence few could match. Roumie wasn't your typical political newcomer. Unlike many actors who remain apolitical, Roumie had a strong moral compass, often speaking out on issues of faith, freedom, and justice. His ability to translate his values into political discourse made him a force to be reckoned with, and Boehner would soon find that out the hard way. The topic they were debating made the stakes even higher. They were discussing the ongoing investigations into various political figures, a topic where both sides had entrenched positions. Boehner, as a former speaker, defended the Republican stance, accusing Democrats of pursuing political vendettas. Roumie, however, argued that accountability and truth-telling were essential, regardless of political affiliation. But beneath the surface of this policy debate, a deeper question loomed. Had Boehner's old-school, insider approach to politics become obsolete? Or had figures like Roumie discovered a more effective way to influence the conversation, not just with political knowledge, but with authenticity and values? What made this confrontation so perfect was that Boehner thought he had the upper hand. He had been watching Roumie's appearances, studying his style, and was convinced he could find a flaw in his arguments. Roumie, while passionate and principled, lacked the insider knowledge Boehner had. Boehner's plan was simple. He would ask a series of technical questions about the rules of politics, pushing Roumie into a defensive corner, and then spring his trap. It was the same strategy that had worked for him in the past, and Boehner felt confident it would work again. But Boehner made one crucial mistake. He was preparing for an old-style debate. He was ready for the kind of political sparring that worked in the past. But Roumie was about to show him that the rules had changed. The cameras were rolling, the lights were hot, and both men were ready to make their case to the American people. Boehner had his notes, his practiced expressions, and his years of experience. Roumie, however, had something else entirely. The debate began exactly as Boehner had planned. CNN host Anderson Cooper introduced both guests, and John Boehner immediately took control of the conversation with the confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Anderson, what we're seeing from House Democrats right now is exactly the kind of partisan overreach that Americans are tired of, Boehner began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had made him a political powerhouse. And Jonathan Roumie, frankly, has been one of the worst offenders. The camera cut to Roumie, who sat calmly, his hands folded, listening with the kind of attention that should have been Boehner's first warning sign. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't preparing an emotional response. He was listening like a lawyer listens to opposing counsel, waiting for the mistake. But Boehner was just getting started. "Let me ask you something specific, Mr. Roumie," he continued, pulling out his familiar rapid-fire questioning style. "In your public statements over the past year, how many times have you directly criticized the Republican Party without offering a solution? How many of those criticisms were based on fact rather than political theater?" It was a classic Boehner move. Ask for specific numbers and challenge an opponent to back up their claims. But Roumie's response was immediate and precise. "Mr. Boehner, in the past year alone, I've spoken out on 14 occasions, calling for bipartisan solutions to key issues. I can list them all if you'd like," Roumie said, his voice steady. The studio went quiet for just a moment. Boehner's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the response he expected. Most politicians would have given a vague answer about working across the aisle. Roumie had just called his bluff with specific examples. But Boehner was a seasoned pro. He quickly pivoted. "That's interesting, because from what I've seen of your public statements, Mr. Roumie, you seem more interested in creating viral moments than engaging in serious policy discussion," Boehner said, his tone becoming more pointed. "Social media likes and retweets aren't the same thing as real political work." This was the attack Boehner thought would land. He was essentially calling Roumie a social media politician, someone who cared more about popularity than policy. It was a critique that had worked before with younger politicians. Roumie's response was measured, but you could see something shift in his posture. He leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge. "Mr. Boehner, that's fascinating, coming from someone who left Congress to become a TV pundit," he said. "But since you brought up political responsibility, let's talk about your record. During your time as Speaker of the House, how many real solutions did you pass? How many bipartisan bills did you bring to the floor?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Boehner's face tightened slightly, but he pressed forward. "Mr. Roumie, I did what was best for the country," Boehner replied, his voice rising. "Unlike the grandstanding we're seeing now, I focused on passing legislation, not creating social media sound bites." But Roumie, who had spent years preparing for moments like these, didn't flinch. "Mr. Boehner, you're talking about political theater, but let's be real here. When the pressure was on, you left your post," Roumie said, his words cutting through the air. "You resigned as Speaker of the House because you couldn't manage the pressure. And now you sit on television criticizing the system you abandoned." Boehner, clearly frustrated, abandoned his script and went for a more direct attack. "Let's be honest about what this is really about," Boehner said, his voice rising further. "You're a celebrity, not a politician. You've been in office for barely a year, and you're trying to lecture people like me who've spent decades doing the work. It was a mistake, a big one." Boehner had made it personal, and worse, he had framed it as a generational argument. For a man who had built his career as an outsider taking on Washington, it was a particularly low blow. Roumie's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. "Mr. Boehner, you are absolutely right that I'm newer to Congress than you were," Roumie said, his voice gaining strength. "But I'm still here, and you're not. So maybe the American people saw through something, just not what you think." The audience in the CNN studio was dead silent. Even Anderson Cooper looked slightly stunned by the directness of the response. But Boehner wasn't done. His face was flushed now, and he was clearly off his game plan. "That's exactly the kind of response I'm talking about," Boehner said, his voice now carrying a tone of condescension that was palpable through the television screen. "Smart aleck comments instead of substantive policy discussion. This is why serious people in Washington have a hard time taking your work seriously." He paused, thinking he was about to deliver his knockout punch. "Mr. Roumie, you've been talking about accountability, but let me ask you this," Boehner continued, his voice rising again. "How do you justify some of the questioning tactics you've used? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're more interested in getting likes on social media than actually getting answers for the American people." It was meant to be his big moment. The experienced Washington hand putting the upstart freshman in his place with a combination of procedural knowledge and moral authority. Instead, it was about to become the setup for one of the most devastating political responses in recent memory. Jonathan Roumie looked at him for a moment, and everyone watching could sense that something had shifted. The polite back and forth was over. The actor's experience on camera was about to show up in full force. "Mr. Boehner," Roumie began, his voice dropping to a tone that anyone who had ever been cross-examined by a skilled attorney would recognize immediately. The trap that Boehner thought he had set was about to spring, but not on the person he expected. The CNN studio had that electric feeling that veteran producers recognize immediately the moment when live television becomes unforgettable television. Anderson Cooper was leaning forward slightly, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be the clip that defined this segment. Jonathan Roumie looked directly at John Boehner, and his voice carried the kind of controlled intensity that came from years of dealing with the media. "Mr. Boehner, since you want to talk about committee conduct and getting answers for the American people, let me ask you something," he began, his tone measured, but unmistakably sharp. "During your time as Speaker of the House, when you had the power to investigate potential corruption in real time, where were you?" Boehner opened his mouth to respond, but Roumie wasn't finished. "Where were you when the Trump administration was refusing to comply with congressional subpoenas? Where were you when we needed someone to ask tough questions about conflicts of interest? Where were you when the American people needed a real watchdog?" The attack was surgical in its precision. Every word was calculated for maximum impact, delivered with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand. "You know where you were, Mr. Boehner. You were on Fox News, getting paid to defend the very administration you should have been investigating." Boehner's face was now visibly red, and he was clearly struggling to regain control of the conversation. "Mr. Roumie, that is completely unfair, and you know it. I served with distinction and integrity," he stammered, trying to maintain his composure. "Did you?" Roumie interrupted, and the interruption itself was like a verbal slap. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you abandoned your duty to the American people the moment it became politically inconvenient." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "You want to talk about social media clips and political theater? You literally left Congress to become a television personality. You traded your gavel for a makeup artist and a teleprompter." Anderson Cooper was trying to maintain his professional composure, but even he looked like he was watching a verbal murder in real time. Boehner, now completely off his script and visibly flustered, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Mr. Roumie, I think the American people can see what kind of politician you are from this display," he said, his voice shaking slightly with anger. "This is exactly why Congress has lost the respect of the American people, because of grandstanding politicians like you, who care more about scoring points than solving problems." It was meant to be his moral high ground moment, positioning himself as the reasonable adult in the room above the partisan fray. Instead, he had just given Jonathan Roumie the perfect setup for what would become one of the most quoted political lines of the year. Roumie looked at him with the kind of expression that experienced trial lawyers would wear when they're about to deliver the line that wins the case. "Mr. Boehner," he said, his voice now carrying just the right combination of authority and dismissal. "Respectfully, you don't get to lecture anyone about serving the American people." He paused for just a beat, the perfect dramatic timing that would make the clip infinitely shareable. "You quit." Those two words landed like a bomb in the CNN studio. The silence that followed was deafening. "You quit," he repeated. The words now carried even more weight. "You didn't lose an election. You didn't get voted out by the people. You quit. You abandoned your post, walked away from your responsibility, and then got a job criticizing the people who stayed to do the work you couldn't finish." Boehner's mouth was literally hanging open. For perhaps the first time in his entire political career, he had no response. The man who had built his reputation on always having the perfect comeback, the devastating follow-up question, the moral authority of the Speaker of the House, was sitting there in complete silence. "So no," Roumie continued, his voice now rising with the confidence of someone who knew he had just delivered a knockout punch. "You don't get to question my commitment to this job. You don't get to lecture me about accountability, and you certainly don't get to criticize my conduct as a member of Congress." He leaned back in his chair, his point made with surgical precision. "Because at the end of the day, Mr. Boehner, I'm still here doing the job, and you're here getting paid to talk about it on TV." Anderson Cooper looked back and forth between his two guests, clearly recognizing that something historic had just happened on his show. The camera stayed on Boehner's face for what felt like an eternity in television time. Maybe 3 seconds, but it was long enough to capture the exact moment when a political career gets redefined. Boehner finally found his voice, but it was weak and defensive in a way that viewers had never heard from him before. "Mr. Roumie, I left Congress for personal reasons, family reasons that I think anyone can understand," he stammered. It was the wrong response. Weak, defensive, and worst of all, it sounded like an excuse. Roumie didn't even need to respond. He just looked at him with the kind of expression that said, "Really? That's what you're going with?" The silence stretched for another moment before Anderson Cooper, recognizing that this segment had reached its natural conclusion, stepped in. "We're going to have to leave it there," Cooper said, his voice carrying just a hint of amazement at what he had just witnessed. "Mr. Boehner, Mr. Roumie, thank you both for joining us tonight." But everyone watching knew that this wasn't really a both sides moment. One person had walked into that studio as a respected political commentator, and the other had walked out as a viral sensation who had just redefined what it meant to win a political debate. As the cameras pulled back for the final shot, the contrast was stark. Roumie sat calmly, completely composed, looking like someone who had just finished a particularly easy cross-examination. Boehner looked like someone who had just been hit by a truck he never saw coming. The handshake at the end was perfunctory, but even that became part of the story. Boehner's grip was weak, his smile forced. Roumie was firm and confident, the handshake of someone who knew they had just changed the game. As they removed their microphones and the camera stopped rolling, you could see Boehner immediately reaching for his phone, probably to start damage control with his Fox News producers. Roumie, meanwhile, looked like someone who was already thinking about his next speaking engagement. The segment was over, but the real show was just beginning, because in the age of social media, the most important part of any political confrontation isn't what happens during the debate, it's what happens after. Before Anderson Cooper had even finished his closing remarks, the internet was already exploding. CNN's social media team, recognizing political gold when they saw it, had the clip posted to Twitter within 90 seconds of the segment ending. The tweet was simple: "You quit at Jonathan Roumie to former Representative John Boehner on AC360. Within 5 minutes, that tweet had over 10,000 retweets. Within an hour, it had over 100,000. By the end of the night, You Quit was trending nationally on Twitter, and the clip had been viewed over 2 million times across all platforms. But the real viral moment wasn't just the line itself, it was the way Roumie had delivered it. The pause before he spoke, the calm, almost conversational tone, the way he had looked directly at Boehner as he said it. It was the kind of perfect political theater that social media was designed to amplify. Within hours, You Quit had become the foundation for an entire meme ecosystem. Twitter users were applying the phrase to everything from sports to relationships to work situations. When your group project partner criticizes your work, but they drop the class, you quit. When your ex tries to give you relationship advice, you quit. When someone who rage quits a video game tries to backseat game, you quit. But the political memes were even more savage. Conservative Twitter users found themselves in the impossible position of trying to defend Boehner without acknowledging that Roumie's point was essentially accurate. He had in fact quit Congress. One particularly viral meme showed a photo of Boehner during his congressional days next to a photo of him on Fox News with the caption, "From I'll hold them accountable to let me tell you what they should be doing, the John Boehner story." Another showed Roumie's calm expression during the "You Quit" moment with the caption, "When someone tries to question your work ethic, but they literally quit their job." The response from Washington insiders was swift and telling. Democratic politicians immediately began sharing the clip, recognizing that Roumie had just provided them with a perfect template for dealing with Republican criticism. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's office released a statement saying, "Jonathan Roumie demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership the American people deserve from their elected officials." But it was the response from progressive firebrands that really showed how significant this moment was. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "This is how you handle bad faith attacks. Take notes." Even more telling was the response from moderate Democrats who don't usually engage in social media battles. Senator Joe Manchin, not exactly known for his confrontational style, retweeted the clip with the comment, "Sometimes the truth is simple." On the Republican side, the response was notably muted. Fox News, where Boehner was a regular contributor, initially didn't mention the segment at all in their morning shows. When they finally addressed it, It was with the kind of defensive spin that suggested they knew they were fighting an uphill battle. John Boehner served his country with distinction in Congress, Tucker Carlson said on his show the next night. The personal attacks from the left show how desperate they are to avoid talking about their own failures. But even that response felt weak. How do you defend someone against the charge that they quit when they did in fact quit? Other Republican politicians largely stayed silent, recognizing that defending Boehner would only draw more attention to the clip. The few who did comment focused on Roumie's tone or disrespect, classic deflection tactics that nobody really bought. Political commentators and media critics immediately recognized that something significant had happened. This wasn't just another cable news argument. It was a perfect example of how political communication had evolved in the social media age. What Jonathan Roumie did last night, wrote Washington Post media critic Margaret Sullivan, was demonstrate that the old rules of political debate don't apply anymore. Boehner came prepared for the kind of procedural gotcha politics that worked in 2015. Roumie showed up with 2024 rules. CNN's own political team published an analysis piece titled "How Two Words Changed a Political Career," examining how Roumie had managed to completely neutralize Boehner's traditional advantages. Boehner had every advantage going into that segment, wrote CNN political analyst Chris Salissa. He had more experience, more name recognition, and home field advantage as a frequent cable news guest. But Roumie had something more powerful, a simple, undeniable truth delivered at exactly the right moment. But beyond the immediate viral moment, political observers began to recognize that this confrontation represented something larger about the changing nature of American politics. For years, politicians like Boehner had built careers on a specific model, using congressional positions to build name recognition, then transitioning to lucrative media careers where they could criticize without accountability. It was a well-worn path that dozens of former politicians had followed. Roumie had just blown up that entire model with two words. What he did, explained George Washington University political scientist Sarah Binder, was make explicit something that voters have been feeling for years, that there's something fundamentally dishonest about people who quit governing so they can get paid to criticize governance. The implications for other former politicians turned media personalities were immediate and obvious. Suddenly, every TV appearance by a former congressman carried the risk that some current politician would hit them with their own version of "you quit." For his part, Boehner attempted a multi-platform response strategy that only seemed to make things worse. The next morning, he appeared on Fox and Friends to provide his side of the story. What you saw last night was exactly the kind of personal attack politics that Americans are tired of, Boehner said, looking notably less confident than usual. Instead of defending his record, Jonathan Roumie chose to make it personal. But the host's question suggested that even his allies recognized he had been badly damaged. How do you respond to critics who say he had a point about your decision to leave Congress? Asked Steve Doocy in what was clearly a softball question designed to let Boehner explain himself. Boehner's answer was telling. I left Congress for family reasons, and I think most Americans can understand that someone might want to spend more time with their family instead of dealing with the dysfunction in Washington. It was a reasonable explanation, but it completely missed the point of Roumie's attack. He hadn't criticized Boehner for leaving Congress. He had criticized him for leaving Congress and then criticizing the people who stayed. As the day progressed, the social media response only got worse for Boehner. Users began digging up old clips of him criticizing other politicians, creating side-by-side videos that showed his attacks next to Roumie's "you quit" response. One particularly damaging compilation showed Boehner during his congressional days criticizing various Obama administration officials for lack of accountability, followed immediately by the CNN clip. The juxtaposition was devastating, and even worse for Boehner, comedy shows picked up the story. The Daily Show did an entire segment on politicians who quit and won't stop talking, featuring Boehner prominently. Saturday Night Live included a brief sketch in their Weekend Update segment about former politicians who don't know their former. For Jonathan Roumie, the aftermath was entirely different. His congressional office reported that they received over 500 calls in the day after the CNN appearance, with the vast majority being supportive. More importantly for his political future, he began receiving invitations to appear on other shows. MSNBC booked him for a week-long series of appearances. The View invited him as a guest. Political podcasts that had never heard of him before were suddenly reaching out. What Jonathan Roumie demonstrated, said Democratic strategist James Carville, is that he understands the modern media environment in a way that a lot of politicians still don't. He didn't just win that debate, he created a moment. But the impact went beyond just political circles. You Quit began showing up in contexts that had nothing to do with politics. Sports commentators started using it when discussing athletes who had demanded trades. Business reporters used it when covering executives who left companies and then criticized their former employers. The phrase had become shorthand for a specific type of hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of abandoning responsibility and then criticizing those who remained responsible. Political consultants immediately began studying the Roumie response as a template for dealing with similar attacks. The elements were simple but powerful. Let your opponent overextend themselves. Identify the core hypocrisy in their position. Deliver your response with surgical precision and don't over-explain. Let the truth speak for itself. What he did was politics 101, explained Republican strategist Mike Murphy, but he executed it perfectly. And in the social media age, perfect execution gets amplified in ways that weren't possible even 5 years ago. The beauty of Roumie's approach was that it didn't require extensive preparation or inside knowledge. It simply required the discipline to stay focused on the fundamental truth and the confidence to deliver it without apology. This made it a replicable strategy that other politicians could adapt to their own situations, creating a new standard for handling bad faith criticism in the modern media environment. For John Boehner, the long-term impact was immediately apparent. Within a week of the CNN appearance, his bookings on other networks dried up. Producers who had previously seen him as a reliable conservative voice began to worry that bringing him on would just create opportunities for Democratic guests to replay Roumie's attack. Even on Fox News, his appearances became less frequent and more carefully managed. Instead of the freewheeling political combat he had been known for, his segments became more scripted and focused on safer topics. The problem for Boehner, explained a Fox News insider who spoke on condition of anonymity, is that he can't really fight back without drawing more attention to the thing that hurt him in the first place. It's political quicksand. 6 months later, You Quit had entered the political lexicon in a way that few phrases ever do. It became a standard response to criticism from former officials, used by politicians of both parties when facing attacks from people who had left public service. But more than that, it represented a shift in how political debates were conducted. The old model, where experience and procedural knowledge provided automatic advantages, had been replaced by something more direct and more democratic. What Jonathan Roumie figured out, wrote New York Times political columnist Maureen Dow, is that in the age of social media, authenticity beats credentials every time. Voters don't want to hear about House Rule 11, Clause 2J1. They want to hear the truth delivered clearly and without apology. The truth in this case was simple. You can't credibly criticize people for doing a job that you quit doing. And sometimes the simplest truths are the most powerful. As political operatives and media personalities studied the Boehner-Roumie exchange, certain lessons became clear about the new rules of political engagement in the social media age. First, preparation matters, but not in the way it used to. Boehner had prepared extensively with notes and procedural knowledge and carefully planned attack lines. But Roumie's preparation was different. He had prepared to tell a simple truth in the most effective way possible. Second, authenticity trumps experience. Boehner had every traditional advantage: more years in politics, more media experience, more name recognition. But Roumie had something more valuable. He was genuinely doing the job Boehner was criticizing others for doing. Third, the social media tail now wags the political dog. The real audience for political debates isn't the people watching live. It's the millions who will see the clips later. Politicians who understand this, like Roumie, structure their responses accordingly. This wasn't just a moment of political theater. It was a masterclass in how to stand up to bad faith criticism and defend your principles under pressure. Whether you're in politics, business, or just dealing with difficult people in your daily life, there are lessons here about the power of simple truth delivered with confidence. If you found this breakdown helpful and want to see more analysis of political moments that change the game, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because in American politics today, everything can change with just 2 words. And you won't want to miss the next moment when it happens. The age of You Quit politics has officially begun. And Jonathan Roumie just wrote the playbook.